Good evening, friends. Apologies for the late start. I was meeting an old friend and time ran on. And before I knew it, had to jump in my car and get back home as soon as possible to start our Bible study. So sorry for starting a little bit late. And I'm sitting in my front room and the sun is streaming in the window. So hopefully I won't go blind because the sun is pretty bright out there. So with that, let us begin our Bible study this evening. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and looking at verses 16 to 33. So I'll just read the passage and we can have a look together. So this is what Paul says. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16 to 33. I repeat, Paul says, let no one think me foolish. But even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. But you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we are too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes, last one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Amazing, amazing passage. Let's open with a word of prayer as we consider our chapter this evening. There's a lot of interesting things there for us to think about. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we can gather around your word, and I pray that you would indeed encourage us and speak to us as we think about these things and the life of your Apostle Paul and the life that you call us to live to as your disciples. And so we ask for your presence and blessing for us as we are coming together this evening, Lord, scattered far and wide, that you would bless our time together. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. So, a remarkable passage again this evening to think about. Paul is boasting about himself, and we talked about this last week. Why does he do this? Because it's, on one level, a bit unseemly for Paul to be going on about how great he is. And I think the language here is often ironic, often sarcastic. Paul is clearly utilizing the mode of argumentation that the so-called super apostles, his critics, his those who oppose him in the Corinthian church would employ. And this sort of boasting, it appealed obviously to the Corinthians. They obviously were taken in by this kind of argumentation. Perhaps they wanted big personalities in their church. Perhaps they wanted men that could talk about their successes and their power and their exploits and their prestige, even their culture, perhaps. But that's not Paul. That's not what Paul is interested in. Yet, in this chapter, Paul will speak likewise of himself in these terms in order to refute the argumentation. And Paul uses this fool's speech, as it's sometimes referred to, this boasting, not in order to make himself look great, but actually Paul will boast in order to reveal his own weaknesses. So Paul will actually, in some sense, you could say, give further ammunition to his critics. But Paul is anxious to show the Corinthians the marks of a true apostle. How can you tell who really has the concern of the Corinthians at heart? Is it Paul or is it the super apostles? Well, Paul says, let's consider the things that they take pride in. Have you a bit of a cold, Shane? I don't. No. Do I sound a bit nasally, perhaps? Interesting. I feel good. I feel great. But maybe it's just the audio. I'm not too sure. I think I am going to be squinting because the sun is going to come right into my face pretty shortly as the sun descends over the west. Okay. First question to consider: what were Paul's ethnic qualifications, and why would these qualifications matter in a place like Corinth, which is not a Jewish city? This is a Roman colony. Why is Paul even going down this road? Have a look at verses 21 to 23. Paul says, whatever anyone else dares to boast of, and I am speaking as a fool, I will also boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one, and I'm talking like a madman. Why does Paul, do you think, go into his Jewish background here? What does that have to do with being an apostle, a true teacher? What does his Jewish background have to do with being a super apostle? Morris says that he was of the seed of Abraham. He was also the Israelites. Not only was he of the Israelites, he was of the Hebrews, meaning he was a Jew of Judean descent, and he was also a Roman citizen. Okay. Why does that matter? I suppose. Why is he even telling people about this? Yes, you do sound a bit nasal. Oh no. Why isn't the church meeting on the church building? Reason is because a lot of us are away at the moment, either on holidays or away. So we thought the best option would just be to have it at home this evening. That is the beauty of the online stream, is that we can carry on really no matter where people are. So that's pretty cool. So yeah, the question is like, why is Paul going on about these ethnic qualifications? He was Jewish. He was well educated by Gamaliel. That is true. That is true. And Gamaliel would have been a very important rabbinic teacher at this time in Jerusalem. Interesting character, Gamaliel, as we know from the book of Acts. He in Acts chapter 5, I think it is, he took some steps to actually defend Peter and the other apostles from the charges of the Sanhedrin. So in that respect, he seemed to be an interesting character, quite thoughtful and to some extent quite moderate in his approach to the early Christian movement in Jerusalem. Interesting that Saul of Tarsus was one of his disciples, because Saul of Tarsus would have had a very different view concerning the early church in Jerusalem. He would have been extremely opposed to it, to the point of being willing to use violence. And that says, is it to show his authority? It seems that that is probably one of the issues here. Yeah, certainly. There is a question of authority. Like, I guess the question is, like, why, in a city like Corinth, which is not a Jewish city, which is a Gentile city, it's a Roman colony, if you're trying to impress people, saying that you're a Hebrew is not impressive um, at all. It's like, to use an imperfect analogy, it would be like someone living in Texas, telling people, "Hey, I'm a Corkman." I mean, great, but the fact that you're a Corkman, I mean, doesn't mean much to a Texan. No, it probably means an awful lot to a Corkman. The fact that they are from Cork. I speak of these things because I have heard these things. But to someone in a different culture, that means very little. In a city like Corinth, the fact that you're a Hebrew, you're an Israelite, it's descendant of Abraham. The question is like, so, I mean, who cares? So Annette is asking the question: Is this going back to a question of authority? And that probably is, along the lines of where we're getting at. I guess to see Paul boasting about his Jewishness, and Paul says this is a silly argument to begin with. I mean, Paul says, I'm speaking like a fool here. I'm speaking foolishly. But the fact that he does bring up this Jewishness of himself, it does seem to indicate that this is probably a line of argumentation that the super apostles were boasting about. Perhaps they were boasting about their own Jewishness in the context of the early church. This possibly is an argument that may have been used to undermine Paul. And that's something to think about. Margaret says Paul was of Jewish descent, yet he gave the gospel to the Gentiles, showing that the gospel was for all and he was called by God. Yeah, absolutely. That is true. Absolutely. Paul hated Christians before, and he wanted to show God's love to everyone, including Gentiles. Absolutely. That is also very true. A question that we should ponder then is, what about Paul's Jewish background could be used against him? What do you know about the life of Paul? If, and we are doing a bit of reconstruction here, if the enemies of Paul were what sometimes is described as the Judaizers, so if it was a conservative element of the Jewish Christian church in Jerusalem primarily that were going out into other churches, and we see this in Antioch, the trouble they caused there. You can read about that in Acts and Galatians too. If that is part of the problem in the Corinthian church, if it is a legalistic element influenced perhaps by a conservative group in the Jerusalem church, and we talked about how previously the people seeking to undermine Paul, they placed great emphasis on having letters of authority. So it could be that they are linked to, in some way, Jerusalem, even though we know from Acts 15 that the leadership of the Jerusalem church would not have endorsed a, a, um, a divisive Judaizing message as they were bringing to places like Antioch. But if this is what's going on, if this is sort of the background here, what about Paul's own Jewishness or his corkiness? That's a nice way. That's a nice way of putting it. Very good. What about Paul's Jewishness could be used against him? Try to put your mind into the first century. Jerusalem, super conservative, traditional. There are people within the early Christian church that are struggling with the freedom of the gospel and want to maintain a legalistic approach that Paul says actually undermines the gospel. But what about Paul's own life? Would you think would they maybe highlight and maybe criticize Paul for not maybe being Jewish enough? What are your thoughts on that? I might scoot down the couch because the sun is like right on my face right now. I'm gonna get like this crazy red face tomorrow. That's Mount Collins there in the background. That's a bit better. Okay. So, what are your thoughts? Where was Paul from? Was he from Jerusalem? What do you know about Paul's life? Well, I'll give you a hint. Paul was not from Jerusalem. Does anybody know where he was from? Morris says, I posted a comment above. Okay. Thank you for posting a comment above. What was the comment in relation to? Sorry. Corkiness? Okay. Margaret says, Tarsus, and he was a Pharisee. Very good. Maybe Jews felt Paul should have been more Jewish, yet to him the gospel was God's grace. Yeah. Tarsus. And Tarsus again. He was from Tarsus. Yeah. I think that would be a problem, the fact that he was not from Jerusalem. If you see here on the map, Tarsus would have been up there, up in Asia Minor, and obviously the mothership is down in Jerusalem. So he wasn't really from the epicenter of Judaism as the Jewish people would have understood it. He wasn't technically from Judea. I think someone emphasized the Judeanness of Paul, but technically he wasn't a Judean. Okay, he was actually from the diaspora. He was born outside of the land of Israel. I think Morris said earlier that he was of Judean descent, and that is accurate. He was of Judean descent, but he was not of Judea. It is a strange thing that Paul starts going on about his lineage and that he is a Hebrew and all this kind of stuff. Because in a city like Corinth, you would think, well, why would he even need to say that? I mean, a Corinthian, generally speaking, wouldn't really care. The issue here may be that the enemies of Paul may have been part of what we see elsewhere in the book of Acts and Galatians, this Judaizing element. The argument may have been that Paul is not really a true apostle and he's not a true Israelite because he's not even from Israel. He's from the diaspora. He's a blow-in. And Paul knows that we spoke about this before. This is a classic ad hominem argument. Where Paul is from does not have any bearing on the content of his message or the fact that he has received it from Christ. But sadly, for some people, this probably was an issue. They probably wanted to highlight the fact that he was not from Israel. He was from Tarsus. He's from Asia Minor. He's born outside of the land. And maybe the argument was because he's not of the land, he's not a true Israelite. And so his message is tainted in some way. Um, and Paul, Paul says it's a foolish argument. It really is. But Paul, he goes to address the issue and he says, I am, a Hebrew. I'm an Israelite, offspring of Abraham, verse 22. The use of the word Hebrew there is unusual. Hebreo, it's not typically used in the New Testament or in this period in terms of ethnicity. It typically is used of a Hebrew speaker. So Paul is maybe saying, look, I am a Hebrew speaker. And we know from Acts that he could speak in Aramaic. He could certainly interact with the Old Testament scriptures, so it's likely that he knew Hebrew. He could also speak and write in Greek, so he was trilingual. But, Paul is saying this is a silly argument. He says, I'm speaking like a foolish person here, but you want to talk about pedigree, you want to talk about lineage. It's a silly argument, but Paul says, I'm a Hebrew. I can speak Hebrew. I'm an Israelite. I'm a descendant of Abraham. This argument has no bearing on the content of the gospel. Morris says, Paul knows very well that his blood ancestry does not make him apostle or a servant of Jesus, but many of the most eminent apostles either said or implied that it was important. Yeah, I'd like to maybe have a follow-up comment there, Morris, in respect to that. What do you mean by many of the most eminent apostles either said or implied that it was important? I wonder who'd you have in mind there? Maybe you can throw a follow-up comment to explain who you are referring to. Are you talking about people like Peter, James, or other people? I'd be interested to know. And Paul was a Roman citizen, and that says, yeah, he was. That was something he inherited from his father, and he used that to great effect in his missionary journeys. But I think what's going on here is a little difficult to follow, but Paul is stressing his Jewishness in the context of his fool's speech. So Paul, if we're following the logic of his argument, Paul doesn't think that this is important. In fact, he thinks it's foolish to be emphasizing where he's from, and what kind of a family he grew up in or whatever, or what kind of languages he speaks. But it was clearly important to some of the so-called Judaizing elements that were influencing the Corinthian church. And that, again, this kind of goes to show us what was important to people like Corinth. And time again, we see what's important to the Corinthian church, sadly, are completely superficial things. So it may be that people had come from Jerusalem and say, Paul's version of the gospel isn't a true gospel because he's not even a true Hebrew. He's from the diaspora, but we're from Jerusalem. We're from the mother church. We grew up in the heartland of where Christianity begins. In the shadow of the temple, all this kind of stuff. And maybe the Corinthians thought, yeah, that's really interesting. That has a better sort of cultural impact, or that seems a bit more respectful than maybe some guy from Tarsus. I mean, who has ever come out of Tarsus that's worth mentioning? It's a superficial argument, and Paul, by boasting in it, I think he's revealing to us what really is being emphasized by these false teachers. These are secondary, superficial things. One's culture should not be a determining factor in their usefulness to the Lord. And as absurd as that sounds, we need to be careful as Christians living in the 21st century that we don't fall into a similar trap, that we have prejudices against Christians coming from other countries or cultures that God would use in our own church or in our communities and that we disdain them because they're not Irish enough or something like that. Um, it's not just the Corinthians that would fall into these kind of superficial, ungodly arguments. We need to be on guard that we too would reject that kind of reasoning. It's the character of the man and woman. It's the gifts that God gives them. It's the calling of God on their life that should be important. Not where they were born. Not these kind of things. It's like someone. It's a bit like, and that says this is a bit like saying someone born to Irish. Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, if we say that, I only want to see people in leadership that speak a certain way, that have a certain accent, it's ridiculous. Paul, by sharing these tidbits about his own life, I think is exposing the futility of this line of argument in general. Yeah, like Paul wasn't from Israel, so he's not a true apostle. I mean, crazy to think that would even be entertained. But in many ways, we could also fall prey to that same kind of line of reasoning in our own cultures. We need to be on guard against that. A bit like the Jews said of Jesus of Nazareth, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. Maybe they applied the same to Paul being from Asia Minor. That's a great point in it. I think that's what we're getting at here. I think this is what's in the background. Remember, Paul, by emphasizing that he's a Hebrew of Hebrews, an Israelite, descendant of Abraham, Paul says this is foolish. This is a silly argument. So Paul isn't relying on this to sort of genuinely bolster his credibility with the Corinthian church. He emphasizes his Jewishness in order to highlight how absurd this line of reasoning is. So we need to be clued into the sort of the sarcasm and the irony that Paul employs throughout what scholars call the fool's speech here in chapter 11 and chapter 12, as we'll see as well. So now, question 2, Paul writes a list of various ministry successes, in inverted commas, amazing experiences and victories, and you could look at Acts. So you could write a list of Paul's various ministry successes and experiences and compare it to the list of sufferings in our passage. What would you, from what you know of Paul's life, if you were to try to sell Paul to a church in Corinth, if you were simply to highlight from maybe even a worldly perspective, the credentials and achievements of the Apostle Paul from what we know of his life, what would you pick from Acts? What do you think? What would be some of the highlights that you would have? So judging from the comments or the lack thereof, am I to assume that you don't think Paul had any amazing experiences or achievements? Oh, that's quite sad. Um, well, when I thought about this, because if you notice in our chapter, Paul, when he talks about his great achievements, they're not great at all. They're embarrassing moments of weakness, actually. Um, but if you look at the career of the Apostle Paul as recorded in the book of Acts, there are, I think, some amazing moments that you would think would be, you could say, why didn't Paul draw from these things? He could show the Corinthians, look at what I have done in 20 years of ministry. I'm not just a nobody. I have an amazing track record. So think about that. Think about what you know about Paul. Margaret says this, God did miracles through Paul. Also, Paul witnessed also Paul witnessed many people coming to Christ in salvation. He spoke to ordinary men and women, and also before kings and rulers. Yeah. So, think about that. And there's a lot in that, isn't there? Paul worked signs and wonders. He worked miracles, miracles of healing, miracles of God's power. Um, Amazing things that Paul did. And also that he spoke the gospel before kings, rulers, as well as ordinary people, and saw many people come to faith and established many churches, not only up in Asia Minor, but also over in Europe. So, yeah, it is interesting that Paul doesn't draw from all of those incredible experiences here in chapter 11. But I think there would be a lot to draw from. Paul was shipwrecked, Annette says. Yeah, I suppose surviving a shipwreck would be some achievement. But if you're trying to convince a Corinthian church that is all about style over substance, that's all about superficiality, that's all about big personalities, that's all about powerful speakers, what kind of things would you draw from to say, look, Paul also has a really good experience in the things that you seem to value highly. And that says he didn't give up on God. That's true. I think that would be a good thing. His tenacity, that's something that stands to his credit, absolutely. Previously, Paul knows very well that his blood ancestry does not make him an apostle or servant of Jesus, but many of the most eminent, that's an old comment, I think. Does that come back up again? Or am I just reading an old comment? Sorry about that. And it says he was saved on the way to Damascus. He boasted only in the Lord. Yeah, if you look at the content here of chapter 11, though, Paul isn't boasting in those things per se. He's actually highlighting a lot of things that went quite badly wrong for him. He doesn't even emphasize people responding positively to the gospel. He actually emphasizes people rejecting the gospel that he presents. But if we were to pick out a few things, maybe from our own perspective, that we would think highlight his achievements, I think Annette hits one really good one there. His encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. I mean, how amazing is that? It doesn't mention it here, but that I think would be a great example. Another comment here, Margaret, he experienced earthquakes in the jail in Philippi, and he saw the jailer and family saved. Another excellent example. That would be a really good one I would highlight, that God freed him from prison through the miraculous intervention with an earthquake. And even though Paul was, you could say, free to go, he remained, preached the gospel to the jailer, and was instrumental in that man's conversion and his family's conversion. So here we see an amazing response of faith to the gospel message. Paul doesn't mention that, doesn't talk about it. I think that would be another good example. He didn't discriminate. That's true. He was a equal opportunity preacher. That's very true. We could emphasize maybe that he was a godly man, a solid Christian through and through, committed to turning his world back to God. He made 3 long missionary journeys throughout the Middle East. Yeah. And all those churches that he planted, doesn't mention that either. Doesn't mention his success in church planting at all in chapter 11, even though this is supposed to be Paul boasting about himself. He stood and preached before kings and princes, as well as endured prison cells. Yeah, so a lot of these things are interesting. Raising of the dead man who fell out the window. That hadn't occurred at this time, but I would definitely mention that if I was going to give a synopsis of Paul's ministry life. Yeah, in Troas, the young man that fell out the window. That hasn't occurred yet in Paul's life, but that would be another classic example of how God used Paul incredibly. I picked out a couple. I think we kind of talked about them all there, but if you just consider Paul's life and ministry, we could say some of the following. So he if I was to boast about Paul, I would say, look, Paul is highly educated. He studied under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. He studied under one of the greatest rabbinic minds of the first century, and spent his formative years, we know from Acts 22 when he gives the account of his life, spent his formative years in Jerusalem. So he's no stranger from the capital, from the very center of Judaism, and from the very center of the beginnings of the early church. We could also, emphasize the road to Damascus. You can see there how Paul had several direct visions of Christ, the road to Damascus being a famous one, but also on his second missionary journey, when Christ spoke to him as he came to Corinth, encouraging him to continue. You could also say another thing could be that Paul not only had visions of Christ, but he was also personally commissioned by Christ. In Acts 9, Christ spoke to Ananias about Paul. So other Christian leaders like Ananias in Damascus were also told about Paul and how Paul was commissioned directly by Christ to be an apostle and to share the gospel. So that again, I think, would be highlighted. If you were trying to impress people, at least, you could say that Paul, for a man who opposed the church, his conversion was so radical, and he demonstrated such a spiritual maturity that he was an excellent debater about Christ. And we see that in Acts 9, him engaging in debates in the synagogues and, having success there. You could also say, not only was he a great teacher, but, up in Antioch, up there in the north, he was a man who, basically was involved in charity work. He was involved in collecting money for the Jerusalem church. So Paul is not only a great teacher, but he's also a great man of compassion. When he went to Cyprus, he confronted the false prophet Bar Jesus, and basically had a public demonstration of his power over a false prophet. You could say up at Lystra, which is up there in Asia Minor, that he had such an incredibly powerful healing ministry and proclamation of the gospel in this Gentile town that they thought he was a god. They offered him sacrifices, which he did not accept. But I mean, you have to say, look, Paul is so powerful that people literally thought he was a god. So if you're looking for a powerful speaker, look no more. At Lystra, they tried to offer him sacrifices. They thought he was Hermes. They thought Barnabas was Zeus. Paul doesn't mention that. He doesn't see that as important. You could go back to Acts 15. Look at Paul's vindication at the Jerusalem Council. That would be a huge moment of vindication for Paul's ministry. Not only did Paul stand firm, but he was vindicated by Peter, by James, by the other apostles, and by the decision of the Jerusalem Council. So the Jerusalem church itself backed Paul. You could say that's a huge feather to put in your hat. You could talk about the powerful ministry he had up in Philippi. You can see it up there, up in Macedonia, and that was mentioned, how he exorcised demons, how he had a powerful public ministry. You could talk about the being divinely freed from prison by the earthquake in Philippi. You could talk about his ministry in Ephesus, there on the west coast of Turkey, how he spent nearly 2 years there doing incredibly powerful things. Acts 19 says that when Paul was in Ephesus, that he was doing extraordinary miracles, God was, by the hands of Paul. Amazing. And you could also say that, look at his career as a whole. Here's a man that has ministered not only in Damascus, but in Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Cyprus, in Troas, Iconium, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth. And that's not even all of it. There were other areas that Paul ministered to. So he is a man of you could say, impeccable ministry success. And yet, when we look at what Paul boasts about, it's it's not successes, it's the opposite. It's times of rejection, it's times of weakness. And I think that's very interesting. I think that is what Paul is trying to demonstrate. He's not boasting about what he can do or what he has done. What he boasts about are those times of great weakness and even times when people have rejected his message. And that brings us on to the next question. Why does Paul focus on the hardships rather than the successes? You look at your text this evening. Um, you know, he talks about imprisonments, beatings, often near death in verse 23. So, that doesn't sound like he's convincing a lot of people of the truth of the gospel. He says 5 times, I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes, bar one. If his enemies are Judaizers, well then, why isn't Paul emphasizing Acts 15 when he was vindicated at the Jerusalem Council? Instead, he's highlighting times when Jewish synagogues, have overtly rejected his message. You'd think, wouldn't that play into the hands of his enemies? They would say, look, he's not even accepted by his own people, so why should you accept him? And Paul talks about rejection, beatings with rods, being stoned. These are not, the testimonies of a successful preaching ministry, you could say. He doesn't talk about church planting here. Okay, he talks about being rejected. It's strange that Paul focuses in on things you could say that his enemies would also focus in on. Maybe these are the things that the enemies of Paul focused on, that he was rejected by the synagogue, that he was a troublemaker, that he was not a convincing speaker. So thoughts on that? Morris says, because it was in his weakness that he experienced the real power of God's grace. And he talks about that, doesn't he, in 2 Corinthians 12. And we will get there. We will have a look at that. So the emphasis really on his weakness is to glorify God. Gamaliel was a very well-respected teacher. He would have been extremely influential in first century Judaism when Paul was living there, absolutely. And maybe you could think, well, Paul maybe should have highlighted that fact, but he doesn't here. Margaret says he'd been accused of being weak, and no one that endured all that Paul went through would be considered weak. I guess, yeah, maybe someone might turn it back on him, though, and say, if you were strong, Paul, you wouldn't put up with all of that, would you? I mean, you wouldn't be the victim of so many beatings and rejections and stonings if you were strong, if you were convincing, if you were standing up for your rights more. Maybe someone might turn it back on Paul. Who knows? God said, I am made perfect in weakness. That is what Paul is trying to get at here. It's really the opposite of what Paul's enemies would have highlighted. When Paul talks about his ministry and boasts about what he has done, in chapter 11, he boasts about all the times it went wrong, humanly speaking. He boasts about all the times, from a human perspective, that it didn't work out. He doesn't emphasize the miracles. He doesn't emphasize the church planting. He doesn't emphasize the conversions. He doesn't emphasize the times when his ministry was vindicated. In fact, all that Paul seems to boast about here is times that his ministry was discredited. So when he talks about receiving 40 lashes minus one, I mean, that is the punishment meted out at a Jewish synagogue. So that Paul is saying that to highlight the fact that Paul's ministry is marked by rejection, by failure, people might say. Hardship, suffering, rejection. Paul says, this is what I've experienced. This is all I can boast in. If the Corinthians are looking for a strong powerful, charismatic leader, a man who was eloquent, a man who was cultured, a man who maybe has the pedigree. Paul doesn't really highlight any of those things in this passage. In fact, if you look at what he talks about here, it's quite the opposite, isn't it? Paul talks about anxiety, pressure. Uh, that's a very unusual expression in verse 28, isn't it? Paul says, I'll boast about daily pressure on me out of my anxiety for all the churches. It doesn't sound very successful. It sounds quite stressful. And Paul isn't ashamed about that. He's not ashamed to express, his own emotional struggles, his own ministry struggles. Paul is highlighting all the things you could say that have gone wrong, but Paul doesn't see any shame in that. In fact, he highlights them. He brings them to attention, even though you could say that his enemies might have even picked up on those things and used them against him. Paul doesn't care. If you're trying to boast about who's the best apostles, Paul says, these are the things that I've experienced. Another thing that Paul boasts about is what he talks about my weakness here. And that is interesting. In verse 30, if I boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Okay. And that is interesting. Again, that's not something that you would expect the Corinthians to take seriously. Now, this word as well, asthenia in Greek, is a very interesting word. It is often, in the New Testament context, this word for weakness is often in the context of physical suffering, illness, or even a physical disability. So, Paul says, I will boast if you are convinced that, it's only the most arrogant, self-assured, boastful people that you think show leadership qualities. Paul says, fine, I will boast. I will keep boasting. I'll boast better than anyone, but I will boast about things that show my weaknesses, my frailty, my disabilities, Paul says. That's what I'm going to boast about. And he does this to highlight the futility and arrogance of the super apostles who maybe are boasting about their credentials, are boasting about their culture. Maybe they're boasting about all the things that they've accomplished. And sadly, the Corinthians are drawn to that ego. They're drawn to that vanity. But Paul says, I will boast about things that highlight my disabilities, my sicknesses. So asthenia is a very strong word that Paul says. My weaknesses. We see it. A classic use of that same word is in Matthew 8, where Isaiah is prophesied. This was spoken to fulfill what was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. The word for illness there, asthenia, is the same word Paul says, I will boast about my weakness. I will boast about my illness. I will boast about my disabilities, you could say. Startling language that, highlights the difference. Paul is placing zero confidence in his human ability. He's placing no confidence in his culture, in his family's pedigree, in his, in his experiences. Paul says, if this is the type of argument you want to listen to, let me boast, but let me boast about the things that you despise. Because Paul says, this is the life that I live. This is the mark of my apostleship. And really, it highlights such a radically different perspective on what is, quote unquote, success in ministry. Radically different. Margaret says, he was weak in himself, but strong in Christ's strength. And that's absolutely true. Jesus told him he would suffer for Christ's name. We see that, don't we, in Acts, where Christ foretold the suffering of Paul. And Paul is not ashamed of that suffering. Absolutely. Paul wants to show the faithfulness and amazing power of God. That is so true. And likewise, in his weakness, he experienced God's strength. And then Margaret says the glory goes to God and not to Paul. Just imagine if you were in a church and you have people there saying, we want a leadership that will bring results. We want a leadership that is polished, cultured, strong, not weak, not cowardly. We want someone brash, strong, speaking the truth to power, standing up for your rights. We want those kind of men. Um, Paul says that's a really foolish way of looking at life. It's a really foolish way of looking at the church. And if it's boasting you're interested in, Paul says, well, here's what I will boast about. Paul then highlights in chapter 11, you could say, all of the failures or all of the difficulties or all of the times where it went wrong. And he does that because it's really what Paul is highlighting, that it's like what Margaret said, the glory is God's glory. Any success we have in ministry is by the grace of God. And success in ministry is marked by faithfulness. That's what is the key for success in ministry. It's much more than numbers. It's much more than prestige. It's much more than reputation. It's being faithful even when the times are difficult. It's faithfulness even when you're rejected, even when the message is not responded to. In chapter 11, if you notice in our section, Paul never highlights those times where he has preached the gospel and people have responded in faith. It's the opposite that Paul has responded or is highlighting. Those times when people have responded in violence, rejection, scorning. That's what Paul says marks ministry. But maybe the Corinthians weren't interested in a person like that. Maybe they felt, well, Paul isn't getting results, so maybe we need a new approach. Maybe there were people who were trying to undermine Paul by saying, he's not a true apostle. He's not really Jewish. He's from the diaspora. I mean, he doesn't have the same pedigree that we have. All of that is foolishness. All of that is completely rubbish. Paul was a human being, not a god or a super apostle, and that is true. Absolutely. Paul's success is God's grace in his life. That's what Paul will always come back to. Paul's success isn't because he grew up in a certain city. It isn't because he had a certain life experience. It isn't because he spoke a certain way. It isn't because he had a great strategy. Paul's success is the grace of God in his life. It's very easy for Christians to want to maybe look to strategies or personalities to bring success in church. But that's looking in the wrong place. We should be looking for people whose lives are marked by faithfulness. And Paul says, I highlight my disabilities. Paul says, I highlight my disabilities, not my abilities. That's what I boast in. That's an interesting outlook, isn't it? That needs to be a perspective. Boasting in disability rather than ability. Because really what Paul is saying is that apart from God's grace, I am nothing. Apart from God's grace, nothing that I've ever done has borne fruit. And there have been times of tremendous opposition and difficulty. And, it just goes to show that I am a human being. I am weak. I have anxiety about all the churches. But what is the mark of a true apostle? Paul says, it's not the things that the Corinthians are looking for. That is for sure. Our last question to ponder is what Paul closes this section with. So he talks about how, he boasts in his weakness, and then he gives us an interesting conclusion. He says in verse 32, at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through the window in the wall, and I escaped his hands. Now, why do you think Paul concludes with that account, and how do you understand that account? What is he actually talking about there? And don't forget, the context of Paul revealing that story is in the context of what he's talking about here. He goes back in verse 18. He says, "Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast." So Paul, this story about the Damascus the Damascus escape is in the context of Paul boasting about his ministry credentials or his credibility as an apostle. So if this is sort of the shining example that Paul concludes this part with, it's worth pondering. Why does Paul, bring us to this example, and what is he talking about, and why is it relevant in the context of him boasting? Morris has the comment that it highlights or illustrates with power the contrast between Saul of Tarsus and Paul the Apostle. Saul of Tarsus traveled to Damascus full of man's power and authority, directed against God's people. But Paul the Apostle left Damascus humbly in a basket. Is there anything more descriptive of weakness than being let down in a basket over a wall? Very good. Yeah, I think that really does sort of hit home there, doesn't it? That's very well put, Morris. That powerful contrast between Saul of Tarsus storming into Damascus and Paul the Apostle being let down in a basket over the wall to escape. So yeah, very interesting. Any other thoughts on that? Why does Paul conclude with this rather startling example? And does anyone have any idea when this would have occurred? So in terms of the chronology here, it's if you're looking in the book of Acts, it's probably around Acts chapter 9. So this would have been after his conversion. It would have been after Paul had already spent some time in Damascus preaching in the synagogues in Damascus, and it probably would have been after the years that he spent, those unaccounted years, we could say, spent in Arabia, that he mentions in Galatians chapter 1. And so it seems that he returned after that to Damascus, where he was met with some pretty violent opposition, and it's then that he had to escape. Not mine, Morgan. So Morgan was the source for that quotation. Okay, I'm not sure who Morgan is. Morgan Freeman? Yeah, who's Morgan? Who is this Morgan person that is full of wisdom? Any other thoughts on it? If you were a critic of Paul, if you could only think the worst of Paul, as some people did, how would you use the concluding example of Paul's boasting, the escape from Damascus? How would you use that against him? How would you use that to undermine him? And Morris says, from the beginning of Paul's life, his life was in danger for the gospel. Yeah, well, from the get-go, he was getting a lot of opposition. That's right, Margaret. A lot of opposition, a lot of violent opposition as time went on. Absolutely, as God told. And just to give the historical context, yeah, it dates to Arestus, the king of the Nabateans. So probably sometime 37 to 39. Yeah, very good. So take into account the 3 years mentioned in Galatians and that this incident happened at the end of those 3 years, we can surmise that Paul was converted sometime between 34 and 36. Okay, very good. And God wants our availability, not our ability. I think that's 100% true in that. And it is interesting that Paul highlights his disability rather than his ability. in his fool's speech in chapter 11. Absolutely. One of the accusations against Paul, if you remember, in 2 Corinthians that was raised is that Paul is fickle, Paul is unreliable, Paul changes his plans, Paul sort of, you can't trust him. And it is interesting that Paul, in this so-called fool's speech where he's boasting about all the great things he's done, where he never mentions great things that he's done, really. I mean, he talks about basically being rejected, but he concludes here with an example of him escaping in a rather embarrassing fashion from Damascus, being lowered down in a basket and escaping, running away for his life. It could be turned against him that Paul is abandoning the church. Classic Paul. He quits when the going gets tough. You know, again, we need to ask, if Paul is facing such a threat to his character, where people are constantly undermining him as unreliable, as not a true apostle, as unworthy, then why did Paul talk about this event that we wouldn't have known about otherwise? It's not mentioned in the book of Acts explicitly in the same context. So Paul highlights it, but it also could definitely be used against him. I think it is interesting that here Paul gives as a shining example of his so-called greatness a rather undignified escape from the city of Damascus, and people could once again use that against him, that here is Paul being unreliable, here's Paul escaping when the pressure comes on. So I think it is interesting that Paul actually is going out of his way in his boasting, you could say, to even give more ammunition to his enemies. Paul had the opportunity in chapter 11 to really compare ministries, to really highlight all the things that we talked about. I studied under Gamaliel. I had a vision of Christ on the road to Damascus. I preached the gospel before the governor of Cyprus. I was active in the ministry in Antioch. I was involved in charity work, collecting money for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. I, put together 2 very successful missionary trips that led into Asia Minor, to Europe. I set up churches all across Macedonia, into Greece. He doesn't talk about any of that. In fact, he starts talking about things that I think could easily be used against him to discredit him even further. But Paul is interesting. Paul uses an opportunity where he could boast about himself to actually highlight trouble. He highlights times when it's gone bad for him personally and in his ministry. He highlights his own disabilities, his own weaknesses, his own sicknesses. And here, the crowning example is highlighting Paul's utter weakness, really, that here is a man that has to run away. And you'd think he wouldn't highlight that, especially in the context that people are trying to undermine his character, that maybe Paul is unreliable. And Paul goes one step further and sort of is scratching the back of his head thinking, what really could I highlight here? And Paul says, I know, the time where I had to be lowered over the wall in a basket like some kind of coward and run away from my life. How about that? How about that for a boast? Again, highlighting Paul's weakness. And he does so, I think, to highlight the fact that what the Corinthian church are most interested in prestige, power, reputation, culture, what the Corinthian church esteem and maybe want in leadership, bashful, powerful speakers, men, not afraid of anything. Paul goes out of his way to say that Paul doesn't know any of that in his ministry, because that has nothing to do with the gospel. That really has nothing to do with the gospel. And Paul will say, in fact, in order to be used by God, we have to move past ego. We have to move past the vanity past reputation and be willing to be used by God, even in the most humbling of circumstances. And that is the way of the cross. That is the way of discipleship. And for Paul, that is the hallmark of faithful ministry. Not arguing about where you were born or where you went to school. All these silly things that the Corinthians were really interested in. And Paul is not embarrassed to remind people that there are times in his ministry where he has been forced to run away. And some people might say, well, you shouldn't have run away, Paul. You should have stood your ground. Why were you running away like a coward? Christ, told the church, if you are persecuted in one town, flee to the next. And that's a challenging message too, because our ego might say, no, I'll stay here and I'll fight. And maybe Saul of Tarsus would have been ready to stay and fight. In fact, he was coming to Damascus specifically for a fight. But he left, humbled, touched by the power of the gospel. And you could say the ego and the vanity were also left behind as he was lowered down over the wall by the Christians of Damascus, who had come to love and revere Paul as one of their own, even though he had come there to persecute. So it's not an example that would be. It's not an example that would really impress many in Corinth, the fact that he had to escape being lowered down in a basket. But for Paul, it's a perfect example of what ministry looks like. And I suppose there is a challenge there also by Paul to the Corinthians, that if you're not prepared to be humbled, if you're not prepared to be put in positions where your own pride is dashed to pieces, then maybe you're not ready to lead. Maybe you're not ready to take on those positions of leadership. He was showing vulnerability as well as humility. Indeed, Paul goes out of his way in this chapter to highlight his own weaknesses. He goes out of his way to highlight those things that you could say add nothing to his reputation, particularly to a city like Corinth. And I think Paul really sees the danger in the church in Corinth being led astray by powerful personalities that are very concerned about reputation and ego and success and prestige and power. And it's sad that the Corinthian church were drawn to those types of arguments, when in fact it really has the opposite effect. It creates arrogance and self-sufficiency. Okay, great discussion tonight. Thank you so much for all of your observations and help. Now, next week, there will not be a Tuesday evening Bible study. I will be out of the country, God willing. So we won't be having a Tuesday evening Bible study, but I will send out the questions for 2 weeks' time, when God willing, we will meet again for our study. And the passage that we will be looking at next week is obviously probably very well known to a lot of us. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talks about his incredible vision in heaven. If Paul is talking about himself, there is some debate about that. He may be talking about another person. I'd like to hear your views on that. And obviously the consequent thorn in the flesh. And that really brings to a conclusion this part of 2 Corinthians, where Paul really is playing the fool, as he will describe it. All of these boasts that he goes on about is foolishness, and Paul is highlighting, I think, the foolishness of this way of approaching the question of what does success in ministry look like. So we'll leave it there tonight. God bless you all, and I hope you have a wonderful evening, and stay close to the Lord and take care of each other. God bless.